All right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you. As if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? Let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by, and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? 2 great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now, that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great because then you could fix it. You could either repair the behavioral inadequacy or the conceptual inadequacy that you're using as a tool in that situation, or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. And so, okay, so you're living in one of these bloody things, and you might as well, it seems to me, you might as well make it the best one you could live in because you don't have anything better to do. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't do it consciously, and this is what the psychoanalysts pointed out, is that you have innumerable quasi-autonomous subsystems that make you up that will generate stories impulsively, and you'll just act them out. And you know that because you watch yourself over 2 weeks and you think, Jesus, I did a lot of stupid things in the last 2 weeks. And you think, why? And it's because you're a collection of somewhat random quasi-autonomous personality units, and lacking a leader, they're just going to fire off whenever they want. First you're hungry, then you're thirsty, then you want to go to bed with your wife, then you want to sleep in, then you want to tell your boss off, then you want to curse at the guy that cuts you off in traffic. It's like you're kind of like a 2-year-old, just it's one emotional frame after another vying for dominance. There's no overarching hierarchy, and there's no king at the top. I've been telling people online in various ways and in lectures that they should start fixing up the world by cleaning up their room. And I wanted to just elaborate on that a little bit before I get back to the lecture itself. So, as it's become this weird internet meme, and it's a joke, and good, it's a joke. I'm really happy about the fact that so much of this has got like the leaven of humor in it. It's really important, because that's what stops things from degenerating into conflict, humor. And I was thinking about this idea of cleaning up your room in relationship to the mustard seed idea. And you see, the thing about cleaning up your room, this is also something I learned from Carl Jung and his studies on alchemy, because for Jung, when the alchemist was attempting to make the philosopher's stone, he was not only engaged in the transformation of the material world, but he was engaged in a process of self-transformation that occurred at the same time as the chemical transformation. So it was a psychological work in some sense. Let's say you want to sort out your room and beautify it, because the beauty is also important. And let's say that all you have is just a little room, like you're not rich, you're poor, and you don't have any power. That's another thing. But you've got your damn room, and you've got this space right in front of you, that's a part of the cosmos that you can come to grips with. And you might think, well, what's there in front of you, right in front of you? And the answer to that is, it depends on how open your eyes are. That's the proper answer, because you could say, and William Blake said this, for example, and Aldous Huxley made comments that were very similar, that in a transcendent state, you can see infinity in the finite. And you might say, well, you can see infinity in what you have within your grasp if you look, and you could say maybe that's the case with your room. And so you want to clean up your room. Well, okay, how do you do that exactly? Well, a room is a place to sleep. And so if you set your room up properly, then you figure out how to sleep and when you should sleep and how you should sleep. And then you figure out when you should wake up, and then you figure out, well, what clothes you should wear, because they have to be arranged properly in your dresser, and then you have to have some place to put your clothes. And if you're going to have some clothes, you have to figure out what you're going to wear those clothes to do, right? And then that means you have to figure out what you're going to do. And then your room has to serve that purpose, because otherwise it isn't set up properly. And if it doesn't serve your purposes, you will be unhappy and not happy in the room, because the way that we perceive the world is as a place to move from point A to point B in. And then if the place that we're in facilitates that movement, then we're happy to be there. And if the place that we're in serves as an obstacle to that movement, then we're unhappy to be there. And so what it means to set up your room is that you have to have somewhere to go that's worthwhile, or you can't set up your room, and then your room has to be set up to facilitate that. And then the next thing is, well, maybe you have to make it beautiful. But that's not easy, right? That means you have to have some taste. And that doesn't mean you have to have money. It doesn't, because you can be garish with money, and you can be tasteful with nothing. All you need is taste, and taste beats money when it comes to beautifying things. I mean, not that money is trivial, because it's not, but taste is crucial. And people who are very artistically oriented can make beautiful things out of virtually nothing. And not only that, the literature suggests that if you're going to make beautiful things, putting real constraints on what you allow yourself to do facilitates creativity instead of interfering with it. Because let's say you have to make something out of nothing, right? Which I suppose would be a godly act, right? You have to make something out of nothing. You have to be creative in order to do that. And so then to beautify your room means that you also have to develop your capacity to be creative. And so then you can make your room shine. But then what will happen is that if your family isn't together, they will interfere with that. You'll interfere with that because you won't have the discipline to do it properly. But then when you start building this little microcosm of perfection with what you have at hand, then it'll evoke all the pathologies of everyone in your household. They'll wonder what the hell you're up to in there. And they won't necessarily be happy, because if they're in a lowly place, let's say, and so are you, and you're trying to move out of that, then the higher you move out of that, the more the place they're in looks bad. And you might say, well, what they should do is celebrate your victory over chaos and evil, but that isn't what will happen. What will happen instead is that they will attempt to pull you back down. They'll attempt to, and I mean, obviously all families don't do that, but all families do that to some degree, and some families do almost nothing but that. And so what that means is that if you're going to organize your room, then you're going to have to confront the devils in your house, and that's often a terrifying thing, because some of those devils have lineages that go back many, many, many generations, and God only knows what you have to struggle with in order to overcome that. And so to sort yourself out and to fix up your room is a non-trivial matter, and you can do that. You'll learn by doing that, and then maybe you'll learn enough by doing that so that you can fix up your family a little bit, and then having done that, you'll have enough character so that when you try to operate in the world at your job, or maybe in the broader social spheres, that you'll be a force for good instead of harm, because you'll have learned some humility by noting just how difficult it was to put your damn room together, well, and yourself for that matter. And so you'll proceed cautiously with your eyes open towards the good. Do you plan your day much, or your time generally? Does this lead to higher productivity? Yes, I plan my day obsessively. My calendar is always absolutely full, and often weeks in advance. And I plan in the morning, especially when I'm on top of things. And I plan each hour, and I probably plan each minute. And yes, it leads to way higher productivity. You decide what your goals are going to be. You place them in the calendar. Use the calendar as your friend, Because what you want to do with the calendar is design a day that you want to have, or a day that would be good for you. And a day that would be good for you is one that you're when you end the day, you feel that you've moved yourself ahead towards your valued goals, and that you've kept chaos under control. And that enables you to sleep soundly and with a good conscience, and to know that the next day is going to be at least not worse than that day. Planning is unbelievably useful. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record with regards to the future authoring program, but it really is useful. You need to figure out what it is that you're aiming at and why, and then you need to figure out how you're going to break that down
over the months and the weeks and the days. But I would approach your calendar like it's your best friend. You think, okay, I'm going to design a week, man, that I really want to have. And that means you can schedule in leisure and all the things that you want to do, which you absolutely should do. And it's also quite fun to give yourself minimal time to do something complicated, because it's quite challenging to see if you can do far more than you thought in far less time.
One of the things the existentialists would say is, what's the relationship between mental health and responsibility? And that's a good question, because it also has to do with something like the definition of mental health and responsibility. It's like, if you want your life to be well constituted, let's say, whatever that means, and it doesn't mean being happy. See, the reason it can't mean being happy is there's going to be times in your life where you're going to be called on to act when you're not happy. So, for example, when one of your parents dies, you're going to make a choice. You're not going to be happy. That will not be, well, hopefully you won't be. Otherwise you're tangled in some sort of Freudian nightmare. But let's assume that that's not the case. You're not going to be happy about it. You're going to be hurt, and maybe even partly broken. So what the hell are you supposed to do then? Well, the answer is, you should be more use than trouble under such circumstances. That's a good thing to strive for, you know, because your mother's going to be, if it's your father, your mother's going to be equally distraught, and so are your siblings, and everyone else you care for. Maybe by that time you should be tough enough so that in that situation, you're good for something. Someone has to make the damn funeral arrangements. Someone has to settle out the will. Someone has to make sure the family doesn't degenerate into horrific squabbling, which is something that often happens after the death of a parent. And you're not going to be motivated to do that by happiness. And what if you have a sick child when you're a parent? Maybe it's a chronic illness. You are not going to be happy about that. You know, it'll be a weight that you carry with you all the time. And it's one of those things that seems particularly unjust. It's like, okay, well, you're no longer happy. Well, if being happy is the purpose of life, well, then you're basically, that's pretty much it for you, isn't it? And you know, these catastrophes that I'm speaking of, you can be certain that you're going to be exposed to many of those during your life. You know, it'll be a rare period. I think it's a rare period in anyone's life where one or more of such things isn't going on chronically. If it's not you with some terrible health problem or some other terrible problem, then it's a parent or a sibling or a child, or because you know you're connected to other people and they're vulnerable too. So that's the lot of human beings. And so if it's happiness, and this is what Solzhenitsyn said about happiness too, he said, happiness is a philosophy who's brought to ruin by the first blow of a guard's truncheon. It's like, yeah, that's about as bluntly as you can put it. Dostoevsky's critique basically said, you can't solve the problem of suffering by formalizing a utopia and joining it like a mass animal. You can't do that because you're not that kind of creature. Even if it was possible, you wouldn't accept it. You'd cause trouble because you're interested in trouble. You're probably more interested in trouble than you are in being happy. Kierkegaard says something similar, but in a more what would you say? In a manner that's more constructive in some sense with regards to what you should do with all that insane energy that you're not going to be able to encapsulate inside a utopia. And it has to do with individual responsibility. I think at least part of it is the complexity of our society. It isn't certain how the future is going to lay itself out, and it isn't certain that what you knew in the past is going to be sufficient for you to move forward into the future. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's very complex. And it's not easy to keep up in our world. You know, like if you look around the world, you might think, well, the happiest people are those where the standard of living is the highest. That's actually not the case.
Right.
And you think, okay, but why wouldn't that be the case? It's like, what do you want? Malaria and death at 40? Obviously not. But then you think, okay, what's the price you pay for a high standard of living? Well, that's easy. You virtually always sacrifice
the present for the future. You're always working. I mean, you guys, you know, I mean, you know, you're fairly influential and you've got this good thing going, but like, it could crash at a moment's notice. You better keep your eye on it. And every day you're thinking, okay, this has to be done, and this has to be done, and this has to be done. And it pays off. I mean, you have a nice studio and I would presume a reasonably comfortable life, but it's not like you're not running on a treadmill to keep that going. And so that's security and it's health, but it isn't necessarily happiness, and it's certainly not necessarily freedom from anxiety. And I would say most people in the modern world, weirdly enough, have far too much to do. You know, 2 career families and a couple of kids. It's like, man, you're done. That's 60 hours a week of flat out work.
Yep.
So, and that can be too much. And then I also think, because our society is philosophically unstable, and that's sort of reflected in this polarization, is that people are doubtful about whether their lives have any meaning, for example. You know, well, why bother? What's the use of it? Who cares? It's like, what difference is it going to make in a million years, you know? And life is hard, and if you just have a nihilistic viewpoint, then it's easy to be swamped by doubts and existential angst and all of that. And like, I think that's a mistake, because I think that your life can be very meaningful. It's proportionate to the responsibility that you take on. And you can learn that by watching when you're engaged in the world, you know, and what works to sort of protect you from feelings of isolation and doom. You know, and a lot of the lectures I have on YouTube are about exactly that.
Positive emotion is associated with movement forward. Like, if you're where you want to be and things are going well, then your behavior should be activated so that you go and get things. Now, one of the negative consequences of that is that if you're really in a good mood, really happy, you're going to be impulsive and make mistakes. You know, because you hear these dough-headed, that's a very minor word, people who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. Way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you, and they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on, because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you know, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like, that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about no? A pure index of positive emotion is no way of determining whether or not a system is working properly, even your own system. You need a balance between positive and negative emotions. Plus, positive emotions are absolutely exhausting, because if you're in a manic episode, it's like, it's time to get everything good right now. Fine, but you won't sleep for a week, and then you die because you just burned yourself to a crisp. And so to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything sounds like a real blast, and I've seen full-blown manics and they're having plenty of fun, but it is not a pleasant thing to behold. They're just all over the place, and you know, yeah, it's really not good. It's really not good. You need a balance between these two systems, because the whole world isn't explored territory bursting with nothing but promise. That's not the world. The world is that in a bounded space, a little bit, with an absolute horror show going out around the periphery. And both systems need to be active in order to keep you balanced. People do, unfortunately, sustain damage sometimes to the left prefrontal cortex, responsible for positive emotion, or the right prefrontal cortex, responsible for negative emotion. And if you sustain right hemisphere prefrontal damage, it makes you inappropriately happy and impulsive, and your life just goes, you just spiral downhill, because you make nothing but impulsive decisions. And you know what the real world consequence of that is, you know? You get drunk and be impulsive for one night, you can learn what the bloody consequences of that are. So often people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine. It's the best they've been taught. They don't see another alternative.
So it could be ignorance, it can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, you know, it's a pain. It's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you know, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things. And that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.
What tips would you give a highly emotional person to become more rational and level-headed?
Oh, well, it depends. There's a variety of... The first thing I would do, if you're highly emotional, volatile, fly off the handle, a lot of mood variation, a lot of negative emotion, the first thing you might want to think about is whether or not there's actually something wrong with you, like physically. You might be ill, because illness can do that to people, and so you should go get yourself checked out. You know, you might have an inflammatory condition or something like that. And the next thing I would check out is like, are you sure you're not hungry? I'm dead serious about this. I mean, with many of my clients who've been anxious, like a lot of them, they come in and say, I'm so anxious. I had this one client, she'd come in and she'd say, God, you know, I'm so dead at the end of the day. I'm just wiped out. I've got no energy at all. All I can do is lay down. She was like 24. All I can do is lay down and watch like the same movie I watched the night before. Is that normal? I was like, well, no, it's not. So, and I knew this. I said, well, what do you eat? And she said, well, I usually don't have any breakfast. And then I have like a little bowl of rice for lunch. And I usually have something like that for dinner. And I thought, you live on 2 balls of rice a day, and you're wondering why, when you come home at night after a full day's work, you don't have any energy. I said, well, have you considered the possibility that you're starving to death? So, you know, we talked about this. I said, you can't live like that. That's not going to work. How about let's try this for a week? You do this with therapy, and you do experiments if you're a behavioral therapist. It's like, you got to come to an agreement with the person. It's like, look, is there some other things you'd eat other than rice? You know, like 4 other things. It's like, we agreed. Maybe she'd eat an egg or something. It's like, or I think it was eggs. And I don't remember what it was. There was a few other things. I said, okay, look, here's what you do. Get up in the morning and like have 2 eggs. You don't have to enjoy them. You know, because people say, well, I'm not hungry. It's like, why is that relevant? That's not the issue here. It isn't like gourmet time. It's not starving to death time. So eat your 2 eggs, and maybe in 3 months you'll enjoy it. You know, until then it'll be like chewing down rubbery cardboard, but it's not that big a deal. So, you know, we upped her caloric intake by a factor of about 4, and she came back, and it was like, I think she came back 2 more times. It's like, oh, I have lots of energy now. It's like, oh, good, you're not dying of starvation. If you're a volatile person, try this. Eat a high-protein, high-fat meal in the morning. No sugar. And a big one. Like have a steak. Have something solid. And doesn't matter if you like it. Who cares? Cook it the night before if you don't want to cook it then. Just try it for a week and see what happens. My suspicions, I've had half my clients, I would say, have dropped their volatility levels 50% by eating a high-fat, high-protein breakfast. And then also notice that if you are crabby, and volatile and touchy and you can't get along with anyone, go eat something. Like have 2 teaspoons of peanut butter and wait 10 minutes and see if you're still a witch. So for some people, and if you are a volatile person, like your blood sugar levels tend to move up and down more because you stress yourself out more. For some people, that really matters. And so, look, try it for a week. It's nothing, right? And you might think, oh, God, what you'll find, if it works, is A, you don't get nearly as upset about the things that used to upset you. And that'll be a shock. You'll think, oh my God, I would have flown off the handle because of that before, and now it's hardly bothering me. So that's a lovely thing. And then the second thing is, if something bothers you, you'll recover way faster. And so that's a good start. And so try that. That's no harm. It's not going to hurt you. Try getting up at the same time every day. That's really important. If your sleep-wake cycle is not regular, and you're a volatile person, say biochemically, genetically, having a sleep-wake cycle that's dysregulated is going to be very hard on you. So it doesn't matter quite as much when you go to bed, although it would be good to regularize that too, but at least pick a time. You can pick whatever time you want. Like I would recommend like 8 o'clock or 7:30 because that's what normal people do. And unless you have a really good reason not to be a normal person, you should start by trying to be a normal person if you're being an abnormal person. So try to get up at the same time and try that. You can combine that with eating and see, like my suspicions are 50% improvement virtually immediately with that. And then if that doesn't work, well, then there are more serious things that you can consider. Being checked out by an MD and making sure you're okay. You might want to go talk to a therapist. Having dysregulated negative emotion is no picnic, man, and it's really hard on the people around you as well. So those are that, and I have this program online I mentioned. The other thing you could try is go online. I have this program called Future Authoring. You could do the past authoring program and bring yourself up to date, but Future Authoring is a program that helps you make a plan for your life. And what do you want from your friends, your family, your career, your education? How are you going to take care of yourself mentally and physically? Where would you like to be in 3 to 5 years? How are you going to regulate temptation, drug and alcohol use, and that sort of thing? Keep yourself out of trouble. And how are you going to stop yourself from deteriorating to where you could deteriorate if you weren't careful? You can do a credible job of the program in an hour and a half. It's proved very useful for people. Maybe you're kind of aimless and you need a plan. That's another possibility. But don't live with it. There's lots of things you can try. Sleep, that might be number 1. Food, that's number 2. Number 3, talk to someone, a professional, if it's really out of hand, because what do you want to do? You want to suffer terribly for the next 10 years? And plus, if you do have a lot of excess negative emotion, it's really hard on you psychophysiologically because you produce a lot of stress hormones, and that makes you old. So it's dangerous physically as well. And it's hard on your brain. So if you can get it fixed, fix it. I don't know what your eating habits are like or your sleeping habits, but if you are an anxious person and that's manifesting itself in, say, neurotic overanalysis, there's 2 things you can do very rapidly, 3 things really, that will help quell that. 4 things even. Number 1, get up at the same time every day, and I would recommend in the morning because that's when people generally get up, and it's good to do what everyone else does unless you have a good reason not to. Number 2, eat a large breakfast, right? Keep it carbohydrate light. Don't eat toast and and Fruit Loops. That's not going to do the trick. Make it fat and protein heavy, and eat more than you want. You might say, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like this has nothing to do with what you want or what your appetite is. It's like you need to eat in the morning. If you're an anxious person
and you don't eat in the morning, and then you stress yourself out, your body hyperproduces insulin. It takes all the blood sugar out of your blood, and that dysregulates your metabolism for the entire day. You can't reset it till you go to sleep at night. And I've had lots of anxious clients who would say fall into the overanalytic category, who were like virtually cured by eating a large breakfast every morning. I would highly recommend that. You could try some physical exercise. Weightlifting is really good for curing anxiety. Another thing you can do, as I alluded to earlier today, is to make a schedule and start attending to your daily micro routines. So, you got to figure out what your overanalysis is. It might be cognitive, like maybe you have a very active mind, you're fast verbally. Are you fast verbally? One way you can find that out is to do something like write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S, for example, in 3 minutes. Do that with a bunch of your friends. And if you're someone who writes down way more words than anyone else, then you're verbally fluent, and that might be driving some of your overanalysis. But my guess is that you're suffering from some rumination that's related to anxiety. And so I told you what I think the simplest ways are to rectify that. I am way too agreeable. What steps can I take to integrate my shadow and stop being a doormat? All my life I've had so much anger, but I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. I've been through a few different types of therapy, and it's a bit better, but still takes me over from time to time. What advice do you have for me? I don't think that there's a better pathway to the shadow, let's say, than resentment. If you're feeling resentful about something, there's a shadow that reveals itself in two ways. One is, it's a pointer to your immaturity. You need to be more disciplined. You have set goals, hypothetically, and if you haven't, then you're under the sway of someone else, or you're undisciplined and unintegrated and incoherent, which is all shadow life in some sense. You're pursuing short-term impulsive goals because you haven't thought it through. You're pursuing goals that other people have established for you. You're not pursuing any goals at all because you're too nihilistic to believe that life has any purpose. All that's shadowy, let's say. But maybe you have set goals and now you're resentful about all the work that you have to do in order to acquire those goals, and maybe that manifests itself as a broad-scale critique of social structure. That's immaturity, and so you can delve into that and you can find out where you're still a spoiled child and hopefully take action to rectify that. Or you may find that you're being compelled to do something that violates your integrity, and you need to stand up for yourself and say something that you don't want to say. And then you may have to learn how to incorporate your anger into your actions so that you learn how to say no when you need to say no. And so that actually means that you're furthering your ethical pursuit as a consequence of integrating your shadow rather than deviating from it. Aggression, which can be repressed, sexuality, lust, let's say, which can be repressed. Those things are extremely useful servants when they're integrated into the whole. If you're without aggression and anger and incapable of it, that doesn't mean that you're on a good path and that anger knocks you off it. That can happen, but it's much more appropriate and sophisticated to note that the probability that you're going to pursue a higher good is magnified by your integration of all your emotional and motivational states, even the ones that can cause a tremendous amount of trouble when they're left to manifest themselves in isolation. You're way too agreeable. Well, I would say you could practice saying what you really believe, that you can take a vow to tell the truth. And that will make you much less agreeable.
agreeable people are perfectly willing to sacrifice what they know to be the case to maintain short-term social harmony. And it's not so much that they repress what they think, it's often that they don't even allow themselves to fully realize what they think. So commitment to the truth can make an agreeable person, will stop an agreeable person from being a doormat. I mean, if you're in a relationship and the person is irritating you with something they've done, you might be highly motivated not to say anything about it because you want to keep the peace. You don't want to upset them. You don't want the conflict. That's all characteristic of high agreeableness. But once you decide to tell the truth, then if you're annoyed, you don't get to hide it. You don't get to assume you're right. You don't get to grab the person by the shirt collar and say, look, I'm annoyed and you're wrong. You get to say, I'm irritated about this situation and I need to think through that irritation to find out if I have a problem or if you have a problem, or if we both have a problem, or if it's a different problem altogether. But you can't hide the fact that the problem has made itself manifest. And so if you're agreeable and you tell the truth about your emotional state, that will propel you out of that agreeableness by necessity. So, with regards to anger, I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. Well, something a cognitive behavioral therapist might recommend is for a week, and maybe this is already a therapy you've been through, but this exercise is generally quite useful. First, you have to note when you're angry and admit to that, and maybe you have to practice that. So you have to decide, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to see when I'm angry, and I'm going to admit to it, at least to begin with, without judgment. I'm just going to observe it. I'm going to allow myself to observe it. Then you have to allow yourself to see what angry thoughts you have. And you can ask yourself that. What angry thoughts do I frequently have? They'll likely come to mind, maybe many of them. You can jot all those down. Those are ones you're familiar with. And then you can notice when you're angry and you can ask yourself, well, what am I thinking right at this moment? What angry thoughts am I thinking? And some of them might be quite shocking. You might also manifest themselves in destructive fantasies. You know, maybe you have a fantasy of grabbing somebody by a shirt collar and pushing them up against a wall, or dumping, hot coffee on your boss, or some impulse towards aggression that might manifest itself as a flashing fantasy. And perhaps one that you're shocked by and don't want to admit. You don't want to admit to the existence of it, but you need to see what's happening first in your own imagination if you're going to cope with it. It's also possible that a fair bit of the anger that you have is actually useful if you could just find out what it is and what it's directed toward. So the first tack is to explore the anger. What gives rise to it? What situations give rise to it? What people give rise to it? What are you doing when it happens? And what is the phenomenology of the anger? How does it make itself manifest in image, fantasy, and thought? And then now you have an anger inventory. Is anger in this situation warranted? What steps do I have to take in order to become less angry? And sometimes that might be an adjustment of an internal psychological adjustment. Sometimes it might require changes in the world. Maybe you're in a relationship that's oppressive and you have been for a long time. And the way to fix that isn't to adjust your attitude, although it could be, but it might be that it's time to get out of the relationship. And so, differentiation. When are you angry? What elicits it? Why are you angry? Who are you angry at? What are the nature of the angry thoughts? What are the nature of the angry fantasies? All of that. You have to get that out where you can see it. Then you have to walk through it. And you can do that by yourself. You can do that while writing. You can produce counter thoughts. So if you're angry about something, you could outline the reasons why anger is not productive, or you could outline the reasons why it's productive and the reasons it's not productive for a full exploration of the issue. Then I would ask you too, if you're angry all the time, is, well, are you depressed? Have you been evaluated clinically? If this is a major problem, is it a manifestation of depression? Because anger is an underdiagnosed symptom of depression. Do you have well thought through goals and plans and strategies? All of that. That's a more comprehensive evaluation of your entire life. And maybe you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. It's highly probable. Most of us have that problem. The right level of focus is the individual. And what individuals can do first is like what a physician should do. First, do no harm, right? Like assume that, you're probably a force for mayhem and trouble unless you've got yourself disciplined and aimed.
Right.
Because you're complicated and troublesome. And so unless you've got your act together, you're trouble. And everyone knows that. And they know people like that. So the first thing you do is constrain the amount of damage you're likely to do. And you do that by disciplining yourself and by also admitting to yourself that you don't know what you're doing, that there's lots of things about you that need to be improved, which is actually, that's a beacon of hope, right? It's like, well, my life is miserable. Yeah, but you're doing a bunch of things wrong. It's like, oh, good, because if I'm doing a bunch of things wrong, then maybe if I fix them, my life won't be so horrible. Well, that's good. And everyone knows about the fact that they're not doing things right, fundamentally. They don't have to examine their conscience that much to figure that out. And then you can start aiming for something good. Start not lying any more than you have to, or maybe not at all if you can train yourself. Then you start to discern truth from falsehood. And then you can find out empirically, does your life get better or worse? Well, I've got hundreds of letters now, maybe thousands of letters from people who have been trying that, and they say, well, I'm way better. I'm doing way better than, than I thought that I was before. I went into a restaurant the other day in Toronto, and this kid came up and he shook my hand and he said, I just want you to know that since I've been listening to you, I've got 3 promotions at this restaurant. And I said, well, good work, man, way to be. And he said, yeah, well, I started coming in on time and I'm working really hard and I'm trying to figure out how I can do a good job here instead of being above the job, I'll take this until I get something better. It's sort of beneath me. It's like, no, probably not. Actually, it's not that easy to do most jobs. It's actually hard to do most jobs, especially to do them well. And it turns out that the world is constituted, if society is set up well, that if you do a good job, invisible doors open in front of you. Because people, and I know this, I've had lots of contact with businesses and academic institutions, and the people who run things competently are often, but not always, very interested in finding young people that they can mentor and move forward. It's actually one of the pleasures of being competent in something.
Yeah.
And so if they see someone who's going that extra mile, busy people have lots of opportunities around them. And they think, oh, I've got that opportunity. I can't really do it, but I can funnel it over to this kid here.
Yeah.
Let's see how he or she does it. And so you say, yeah, you want to try this? And the person says, well, I don't have time. It's like, well, okay. But the smart kid says, yeah, yes, I'll do that. And then the person with opportunities watches and thinks, okay, well, let's, we'll back up a bit, see if the person does it. And if they do it, it's like, hey, here's 4 more opportunities that I don't have time for. The system is rigged against you, okay? You're gonna die. You're gonna be ill. It's rough, man. Now, you don't want to lay that at the feet of the social structure, because the social structure, at least in part, is trying to have you not die. right? I mean, that's why we have walls and electricity and all of that. It works pretty damn well. You know, you're probably going to live till you're 80. And the only reason you're not going to live longer is because we can't figure out how to get you to live longer. That's why. You're not going to starve to death. Wild animals aren't going to tear you in pieces. Tyrants aren't going to rip you from limb to limb. It's like, these are good things. Now, you still got a big problem because the cosmic system is rigged against you in a sense. But, okay, so fine.
What do you mean by that, the cosmic system?
Well, you know, you're vulnerable and you can be broken, and you will be in many ways. But you can't blame someone for that. It's just, that's the structure of reality. Okay, so what do you do about that? Well, as far as I can tell, and I've always looked as a psychologist for optimistic ideas. And I'm not an easy sell with regards to optimistic ideas, especially because of my basic belief in the idea that, you know, the most profound truth is that life is suffering. It's okay, fine, life is suffering. You can't blame that on anyone. All right, so what do you do about it? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe nothing. Maybe the jig's up. It's hopeless, you know. But maybe that's not right. Maybe here's something. What do you have against the suffering and the malevolence, let's say? You have possibility. You have potential in front of you, inside of you even, whatever that means. So here's the question. What would your life be like if you made use of all the potential that you were offered? That's the optimistic question, because you can test it out. Say, okay, well, I'll just try that for a year. I'm gonna do the best I can at everything that offers itself to me, just as an experiment. And then I'm gonna see, well, is my life better or is my life worse? It's like, you try it for a year, you think, it's actually better. My friendships are better, my family's better, I'm less anxious, I'm more positively oriented, I'm less resentful and bitter and jealous and angry. You know, I'm more physically healthy. It's like, hey, great, and you're not that good at it. It's like, what happens if you did that for 5 years?
Yeah, that's a good addiction.
That's an addiction. Yeah, it's an addiction to possibility. And then it's also an exponential thing. And this is actually technically true. We know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's this principle that economists talk about. They often call it the Matthew principle, which is based on a statement in the New Testament. From those who have everything, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's really a vicious statement. But what it means is, as you go downhill faster and faster. And people know that. It's like, it isn't linear, man. It's exponential. You do one thing, stupid, then 2 stupid things happen, then 4 stupid things happen. And, before you know it, you're done. But the reverse of that is also true. You do one good thing and then, you get 2 opportunities and you fix them up and you get 4. And this is how the world works. It's a fundamental economic principle. And you see, because of that a small proportion of people have most of the gains accrue to them. And they're the ones, they're healthy. That's luck often, They didn't get run over by a bus. Like, there's lots of arbitrary things about life that have to go right. But after that, it's like, those are also people who are capitalizing on what they're being offered without bitterness or resentment. And then maybe it won't work for you, but you don't have a better plan than that. So there's a rule for working with old people in old age homes, and the rule is, don't do anything for the residents that they can do themselves. You think, well, that's pretty harsh. It's like, no, it isn't. You're helping them retain their independence and their strength, right?
Yeah.
So you're not stealing their strength. And it's the same with little kids. Like, little kids should be doing whatever they can that's productive and useful as young as they can. People talk a lot about self-esteem, which is it's very badly conceptualized self-esteem, because it's come to mean you should feel good about yourself, which I don't believe. I think you should feel good about who you could be if you got your act together. And you shouldn't be feeling so good about who you are now in your sorry state. It's like, what the hell, man? You're 17. Don't be feeling too good about yourself. Get your act together and see what you could be, and feel good about your trajectory.
Yeah.
That's way different, but also your competence. And so, like, even with little kids, is they know they're being taken care of. They have an existential debt to their parents. It's like, if you allow them to be useful and encourage them to do things, then they get to pay off that existential debt. And then they can see that they're contributing members of even this small society. And it's no lie.
I'm 40, but I feel like a child watching everyone around me get older and die. So I'm homesick for the past instead of accepting the terrifying present. How can I stop mourning the past? Well, I grouped the last 3 questions together, including this one, because they all allowed me to talk reasonably about these programs. The self-authoring program has a past authoring component that helps people write out an autobiography. Now, you're suffering from what Freud described as reminiscences of the past. You're possessed by reminiscences. They won't get out of your mind. And what that means to me is, well, it's one of 2 things. One is that there's things in your past that you need to understand more deeply. And that's why they're still calling to you. And there are things in your past that you had, perhaps, that you need to have in the present and the future. And so you could do the past authoring program and write out your past. It asks you to detail the most emotionally significant events that occurred during different epochs or stages of your life. So you have to break your life into a number of stages. I think we recommended 6, but you can break it into as many as you want or as few. And then to detail out the significant positive and negative occurrences, that stand out in your memory from those times. And that'll kind of help put the past to rest, but it also might highlight for you what it is that you're nostalgic for. And then that can help you figure out what to aim for in the future. And so, it sounds like you're rather hopeless about the present and by implication the future. And maybe that's because you don't have a richly enough developed conception of what it could be. So you could go back to your past and find out what it is that you wanted and had, and then you need to make a plan for how you might obtain that in the future. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that because you talked about death, and so you may be longing in some sense for a return to a state of blissful ignorance where you weren't concerned about mortality. And, the only real medication for that, I think that's real, is to live as worthwhile a life as you can, as full a life, so you don't have regrets. I'm not sure that so much that people are afraid of death. They're maybe afraid of not living enough. And maybe if you lived enough, you could let it go when it was time. I think there's some truth in that. And so if you're overly afraid of death, it may be because you have a lot of unlived life in you. And you could go back to the past and you can find out what you needed and perhaps had then, and then you can strive to attain that in the present and the future. And those exercises could, at least in principle, help you with that. So what are you missing, right? What are you missing that the past had for you? And maybe you write that down. Like, well, I had this and it was really important to me. And I had a loving relationship with someone and I don't have that now. I had the security of a comfortable home life and I don't have that now. It's, well, those are things that now become ambitions, right? Because an ambition and a lack are mirror images of one another. And so if you can identify what you lack, you can derive an ambition from that. And you might say, well, that's impossible. It's like, well, you decompose it into small steps. And that's complicated, but so life is complicated. So there's no way around that. I'm 25. Had a drug problem when I was younger. In my late teens and early 20s, I stole money on multiple occasions. I don't even know who some of those people I stole from are and can't repay them. However, even in the instances where I could apologize or repay, I feel completely unable to. I'm too ashamed. This bothers me all the time. I can't sleep or do anything. I really hate myself. I think that I'm a rotten person and don't know how to handle it. Do you have any advice for this? Well, if I was your therapist, I would say, tell me about every single occasion that you remember where this happened. Now, you can't tell me because I'm not there, but you could write it down. And that would help. And maybe you could write down why you did it. And maybe you could do that with a bit of compassion. Obviously,
your behavior was sufficiently reprehensible to be plaguing your conscience, but at least you have a conscience, that's something. And people make mistakes, especially when they're young, especially when they're addled by drug use, let's say. There's plenty of occasion there for misbehavior, that's for sure. And it's pretty common. In any case, you're plagued by this. So the past has still got its tentacles around you. Well, write it down. Write down every episode. Every time you worry about something like that, write it down and get a list. That's your symptoms. Then, the idea of approaching one of these people and apologizing and offering to repay them, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe you could list all the people that you stole from who you could do that with, and then rank order them in order of difficulty, and then think about how you would approach the least difficult of all those people and what you'd say. And maybe you have to write that out. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it, but you could do that to begin with, and then you could decide whether or not you could do it. And if you could do it with the easiest person, and then you could see how that goes. Maybe that actually helps. And then if you can't do that, maybe there's some other means of clearing your conscience. So when you write all this down, write down how much you took. And then maybe your goal could be you donate twice that amount to a charity. So you have to research charity and find one that you think is really valuable, where it would do some good. And so, you don't have to pay it all back at once, but maybe you could pay once a month or whatever. I don't know what your budget is. Maybe twice a month, maybe once every 3 months, whatever you could afford. And so then you've atoned for your sin, let's say, and you've transformed something bad that the people who experienced have probably already forgotten about. I mean, unless you were stealing huge amounts of money and destroyed their lives, they've probably moved on. And so you could transform your nefarious actions into something that was good. Now, maybe donation to charity, wouldn't do it for you. You could try it once and see if that helps, pay off one of your existential debts and see if that helps. It's a negotiation with yourself. And so then I guess I would also ask, are you more broadly depressed and anxious? You know what I mean? So are you fixating on this in a manner that's truly counterproductive, that's reflective of a deeper issue with depression or anxiety? And you'd know that, for example, if, while you said you can't sleep or do anything, you really hate yourself, that's signs of generalization beyond the confines of these misdeeds. And so if that's the case, then perhaps even if you did atone for what you had done, other preoccupations with previous instances of unacceptable behavior would start to plague you to the same degree. That's a more complex problem, and if that's the case, then, your best bet then is to find a competent mental health professional and have your circumstance evaluated. And, if you're really torturing yourself to death about this, despite the fact that you've apparently ceased your drug abuse, maybe there's something else fueling it, and you may need to investigate that. So that's about all I can think of along those lines.
Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it, you value it, and no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this, I can't stop communicating with my mother who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule. So we have real problems, and so life is actually difficult, independent of psychological foolishness, let's say, independent of the obstacles that we put in our own path.
It's
Life
already
is
challenging.
It's already fatally challenging, right? Life is the ultimate challenge.
We will die.
Yes, and
So there is a challenge, yeah.
Yes, well,
Uncertainty, fear, pain, all those
yes,
things. Yeah.
Everything that goes along with suffering is a challenge, and it's the full challenge, because it takes everything you have. And so part of the reason we disagree is because there are complex problems to solve, and then we also disagree because we're willfully blind, and because we're more ignorant than we should be, and we're not everything we should be, and we tilt towards malevolence from time to time, and we betray each other and ourselves, and so we take a bad lot in many ways and make it worse. Now, not always, obviously, and we don't have to, but that's sort of the baseline that we're working against. I think people are most disappointed in life when they're disappointed in themselves. You know, they see that they've made things worse than they had to be, even though the baseline can be pretty brutal. So, yeah, and so the book and all my lectures, I suppose, are put forward in an attempt to take the high-level philosophical abstractions and to make them into something that's actionable.
And to take the next best action in your life to improve your life, so we don't have to suffer as much.
Well, and hopefully also so that people around you don't have to either. So one of the things I've been talking to my audiences about is the relationship between responsibility and meaning, which is, what would you say, it's a constant refrain in the book. It's one of its underlying messages, let's say, or themes is a better way of thinking about it. You know, if you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life, and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that, and they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. So if you think, for example, if you think about the people that you admire, well, you think about when you have a clear conscience first, because that's a good thing to aim at, which is something different than happiness, right?
A clear conscience is different than happiness.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah.
That's
you're not
better.
Like guilting yourself. You're not feeling bad about yourself.
That's right. You feel that you've justified your existence,
Yeah.
right? And so you're not waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat thinking about all the terrible things that you've involved yourself in.
What you said to someone that you shouldn't have said, or how you acted, or lied,
Or what
or
opportunity you lost, or the things that you've let go that you should have capitalized on, and all of that. And so if you think about the times when you're at peace with yourself with regards to how you're conducting yourself in the world, it's almost always conditions under which you've adopted responsibility, right? At least the most guilt I think that you can experience perhaps is the sure knowledge that you're not even taking care of yourself, so that you're leaving that responsibility to other people, because that's pretty pathetic. And unless you're psychopathic and and you're living a parasitical life, and that characterizes a very small minority of people, and an even smaller minority think that's justifiable. But most of the time you're in guilt and shame because not only are you not taking care of yourself, let's say, so someone else has to,
but you're not living up to your full potential.
You suffer even more when you don't take care of yourself or take the best actions or do the work that you know you can do, and you rely on someone else to support you financially, emotionally, physically, whatever, home, whatever it may be.
Yeah, well, because you're not only not being what you could be, you're interfering with someone else being what they could be, right? So you're not only a void, you're a drain.
Right.
Jesus, that's a catastrophe.
But we usually don't even know it when we're in that situation, because we're in a depressed state, or
we don't want to see it. You wake up at 3 a.m. and you know. And then you think of the people that you admire yourself, or perhaps you can at least live with yourself when you're taking responsibility, at least for yourself. And so that settles your conscience. But then if you look at the people that you spontaneously admire, and so the act of spontaneously admiring someone is the manifestation of the instinct for meaning, right? So this is partly why people are so enamored of sports figures, because the sports figures are playing out the drama of attaining the goal, of attaining a certain kind of, let's say, psychological and physical perfection in pursuit of the goal. That's the drama. And to spontaneously admire that is to have that instinct for meaning latch onto something that can be used as a model. And then that model should be transcribed into something that's applicable in life. And you really like to see, in an athletic performance, you really like to see someone who's extremely disciplined and in shape do something physically remarkable, and to stretch themselves even beyond their previous exploits, because you really like to see a brilliant move in an athletic match. But you also like to see that person ensconced in a broader moral framework, so that not only are they trying to win and disciplining themselves in pursuit of that victory, and then stretching themselves so they're continually getting better, but they're doing it in a way that helps develop their whole team, and that's good for the sport in general, and that reflects well on the broader culture.
They're a great leader in their team, they're positive, they're good sportsmen against the competitors, they're not negative towards the other people, they're lifting them up too.
Yeah.
Like the ultimate human.
That's right, so that they can work for their own improvement in a way that simultaneously works for the improvement of their team and for the sport, and then to the degree that spills over into the broader culture, so much the better. So that's all being dramatized in an athletic event, and it's not philosophical, it's concrete, right? It's dramatized in the world, and that's what the games represent. And so, and it's partly because, in some sense, life is a game.
It is.
It is, in that you're always, the analogy is that in life, like in sports, you're setting forth an aim, and then arranging your perceptions and your actions in pursuit of that aim. And that you also generally do it while cooperating and competing with other people.
Right.
So that's also the game-like element as well. All of that's dramatized in athletics.
Yeah.
That's like philosophy for people who aren't philosophical. And I'm not being smart about that.
Yeah.
It's like it really is philosophy for people who aren't being philosophical, because it's played out, And you can see it too. You can see the spontaneous appreciation for the human spirit manifest itself when you see people rise to their feet spontaneously in a sports arena when they see someone do something particularly remarkable. See an athlete who's extremely trained stretch themselves beyond what you'd think is a normative human limit, and everyone celebrates that, like, spontaneously. So it's quite something to behold. What philosophy is, or even theology for that matter, is an abstract model, like it's laid out in words. Now the problem often is it becomes so abstract that people don't know how to bring it back down to embodiment.
Yeah.
Yes, whereas something like the drama of a sports event is sort of midway between philosophy and action, right? It's not entirely abstracted, because it's not only coded in words, it's acted out.
It's visual, you can see an example of what just happened. And you can try to reverse engineer how they did that.
Well, yes, exactly. Well, at least the fact that you admire the person means that you might start to try to act like them. Now, it's not easy, and maybe that would mean that you start to discipline yourself with regards to a particular sport. But it might also be that you start to mimic, or are at least affected in some way by their sportsman-like behavior, right?
Yeah.
Which is the ground of a certain kind of ethic. Because if you can play well with others, which is sort of the hallmark of a good sport, then that actually means that you're a reasonably sophisticated and civilized person. It's really important to learn to play well with others. There isn't, that's the ground of ethics.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. Often young people are afraid of commitment, for example, in the context of a romantic relationship, and because they feel that that's going to interfere with their pursuit of something more valuable. But that's just not the case. You're not going to find something more valuable in your life than a committed relationship with someone that you love, that sustains itself across time, and that in all likelihood produces children. That's life. And there may be people for whom avoiding that is the better route, but those people are very rare, and you need a real reason to assume that you're one of those people. And hopefully for you, you're not. I've had a very good career, a very meaningful career in multiple dimensions, and it's still been the case for me that the most important part of my life has been my intimate relationship with my wife and my family. So don't be afraid of that, or be afraid of it, but don't let that stop you from pursuing it. One of the studies was a study of motivation, technical study of motivation in rats. Let's say you want to motivate a rat. Okay, so first of all, you make them hungry, and they'll work for food. So then maybe you have him learn this maze. He has to run the maze to get the food reward. And so he runs it a few times. He knows there's food there. So you put him at the beginning of the maze and you let him go. And then you watch how fast he goes to the maze. Now, there's a couple of ways you can measure his motivation. You can attach him to a spring and have him pull against the spring. And then, you get some estimate of how much work he's willing to put in to go down the maze. Or you can time him. Okay, so now imagine you got your hungry rat and you let him go at the beginning of the maze, and he zooms up to get the food, and he's, moving at like 10 miles an hour. But now you do something different. You put him in the same place, but as well as him being hungry and going after the food, you waft in a little bit of cat odor.
Danger.
Now, yeah, rats hate cats. They can't stand them. Even if they've never met a cat, they can't tolerate the odor. It really terrifies them. And so that rat will run towards that food much faster than he will if he's just hungry. And so, like, if you want to run towards something that you want, it's really useful to be running away from something you truly don't want.
Yeah.
And I thought about, so that's part of the reason we built that into the system. And I had a metaphysical take on that too, which is like many religious systems have a kind of notion of something like hell that's very well developed in Christianity. And so hell is where you end up when you lie. That's one way of thinking about it, in a very good way. You might think, well, is there any psychological utility in that idea? And the answer is, yeah. You need to know where you could end up if things went wrong, because then you're motivated by fear to move forward. If you're not motivated by fear to move forward, then your fear's in front of you stopping you, because you might think, oh my God, I can't take the risks necessary to attain these goals. What if something goes wrong? Well, it's like, yeah, well then you're frozen. But if you think, no, wait a second, there's risks to proceeding, but nothing compared to the risks of failing. So then the fear is behind you, pushing you forward. That's so you need a vision of hell. It's like, okay, what's your personal vision of hell? You let your life fall apart because of your own stupidity and your own blindness. It's like you're the worst place you could be in 5 years. Well, that's what we ask people to write about. Arithmetic helps too.
In which sense?
Well, this is something I've done with big groups of students and my clients as well. It's like, okay, I ask students in particular between the ages of, say, 18 and 20. It's like, well, how much time do you waste in a day? Is it an hour? And people say no. Is it like 4 hours? No. 10? No. It's usually about 6. I can get a group of 200 students to agree that they're just wasting 6 hours a day. No, and by their own definition of wasting, right? So, okay, so then we do some mathematics with that. We've got the 6, that's fine, 6 hours a day. Okay, so that's 40 hours a week. All right, so then I think, well, what's your time worth? And they think, well, minimum wage, because most of the students, if they went out to work, they'd only get minimum wage. But that's not right, because that's a discounted version. Their time is worth way more than that if they're working on something useful, because it's an investment. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that if you're a reasonably bright student, your time is worth $25 an hour, or something like that, because of its potential for future payoff. It's okay. Well, that's $1,000 a week. Right, so it's $4,000 a month, it's $50,000 a year. In 4 years, it's $200,000. So that's what wasting your day is costing you. It's like, let's make no mistake about it. You're going to be $200,000 poorer in 4 years because you're wasting your time. Is that really what you want to do? You're rich enough so that you're willing to forego that $200,000. Well, no one's ever sat them down and said, look, put an estimate out of the value of your time. Figure out how much of it you're wasting, and then ask yourself if you really think that that's a good idea. Because it's actually not a good idea. And I don't think anybody thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah, damn straight. I think it ties into if it gets measured, it gets managed. The moment you start putting stuff down in numbers, that does something to our brain.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the goal setting issue. It's like you calibrate things and make them precise. You can no longer hide from it. And the funny thing too is that, because I also ask the classes the same thing. Well, do you enjoy yourself while you're wasting that time? And the answer is always no. People feel terrible. It's like, they're watching one YouTube video after another that they're not even interested in, or they're watching like endless amounts of pornography or some damn thing, or they're playing video games, not because they want to, but because they can't stop, and they know they should be doing something else. It's not enjoyable time. So not only is it and that's part of why it's wasted. It's like, it's not productive and it's not enjoyable. Well,
so how much of that procrastination is, because setting goals is a great counter to that, so how much of that behavior, if you look at it, because it's not rational behavior, is also sort of kind of same like goal setting, wired into us because of our evolutionary path? I've always wondered about procrastination in myself, like why am I like that every now and then?
That's a good question. Well, look, procrastination needs no explanation. The answer to should you do something difficult and energy intensive is no, because it's difficult and it's energy intensive, right? So there actually has to be your default position can easily be, no, I'm not going to do that difficult and intensive thing. There should be some internal resistance to doing that because it's costly. Okay, well, but then you think, well, wait a second, there are conditions under which investing in something intensive and energy demanding is appropriate. Well, yeah, but you got to specify the conditions. Like, why should you listen to yourself? You can think about it this way. Why should you listen to yourself if you're an idiot? You know what I mean? If you don't have a plan, your body's thinking, no, I'm just going to sit here and take it easy because who knows when the next antelope is going to come along so I can kill it. I'm just going to lie here like a lion and wait. Yeah. It's like, no, you need a reason that that's a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think a track record, like the goals and the reasons and that you've already chased after a few antelopes, for example, and you've actually managed to do it. So you can.
Well, there's that too. Because your deeper self might be saying, well, you want me to get up and do something. What makes you think I can trust you? You're not just running down some blind alley. Well, if you've had some victories, you can say, no, we're serious about this. And so, and the goal setting too, like I would think about it more like, it's more like the development of a vision. It's a better way of thinking about it, I think. Because goals, it's a bit narrow in a sense. The idea is that you can have a vision of the future and a counter vision. And that you, not only can you have it, you need that. It's, without that, you won't move forward against your procrastination.
How do you remain focused and productive in the face of insurmountable work?
Lists, schedules, and I have help. I mean, my wife in particular in the last year has been unbelievably helpful. I mean, it's become a full-time job for her, really, helping me manage my schedule and keep me on track. But a lot of it is, like, I get up in the morning, I have, like, everything scheduled. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. There's a hierarchy of priority. And I'm really operating on a day-to-day level right now because there's so many things to do. I can't look more than about a day or two ahead, although it's basically scheduled. But I learned to discipline myself when I was in graduate school. When I was writing, I wrote a book called Maps of Meaning that was published in 1999, and I worked on that for about 15 years, about 3 hours a day. And I really sort of grabbed myself by the scruff of the neck and like forced myself to learn how to concentrate without deviation. There's a couple of things that I'm doing that are different from what people usually do, So in the last 20 years, the constant message to young people is self-esteem, feel good about yourself. It's like, I don't buy that. I think that you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, Jesus Christ, I could be a hell of a lot better than I am.
Yeah.
And the thing is, there's nothing more complimentary to tell a young person than that. It's like, look at you, you're a wreck. Grow the hell up. There's so much more to you than you're manifesting than you can hardly imagine. It's like, well, you think that's a criticism. It's like, no, it's not. It's a great compliment. It's like, look at how much more you could bring out into the world.
Yeah.
Get your aggression under control. Strengthen yourself. Like, take on some responsibility. See if you have enough bloody courage to tell the truth. Put your life together. Stop whining. And the men eat that up because no one's ever told them that, which just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
It's so bad. And, the boys are pulling out of everything. They're pulling out of university. They're pulling out of life. They're pulling out of marriage.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're more awkward and unsophisticated than they would otherwise be, and much more prone to make sexual errors, some of which are, predatory malevolence in the small proportion of cases. But it's another one of those situations, like imagine that 1 in 100 men are sexual predators.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 1 in 50, but let's go with 1 in 100. Well, that small proportion commit all of the sexual predation. Like if you look at criminals, it's the Pareto distribution again. 5% of the criminals produce something like, the overwhelming majority of the crimes, right? It's a small coterie of specialized people who are responsible for all the criminality. Lots of people are in prison because they did one heinous thing, like they got enraged or drunk and did something violent. But there's the serial criminal types, and they're the ones that like we had one guy in Toronto, for example, who ran a bike theft ring, and they finally nailed him. And like, there weren't any bikes stolen in Toronto after that. It was just him and his little coterie of, organized bike thieves. And these guys that are being outed, these serial predators, they are responsible. Like one predatory guy can prey on, who knows, 500 females, 1,000 females in a lifetime, So
it almost seems like, this is a lot of guys. I was one of these guys who sort of turned away from society for a while, like into computer games and like this slacker identity, which is sort of, I guess it's always been there. Like you turn to like away from all responsibilities and you go to the dream world. But the opportunities to do this is so much larger now.
It's the Lost Boys, like in Peter Pan. Right? They're in Neverland and they never grow up. And Peter Pan is their leader. That's the story. And it's not surprising because it's easier to occupy yourself trivially than it is to do something difficult.
What are the top 3 rules for being the best man I can be for the people I love?
Well, rule number 1 is ask that question. That's a good question. That's a meditative and prayerful question. I don't think there's any difference, by the way, between prayer and thought. I think that thought is secularized prayer. I think that's even true, like evolutionarily and historically. And then the question is, well, what is prayer? And by implication, thought. And that is the opening up of yourself to revelation, and then the critical analysis of the revelation. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, when you think, you admit your ignorance, because why think if you're not ignorant? And you note that you have a problem, and you formalize the problem, which is to ask the question associated with the problem, and then you open yourself up for receipt of an answer. It's really important to get the question right. There's the first rule. Get the question right. That's a pretty good question. That question is, how am I the best father and husband in relationship to those I love? And then that has to be a question. And then you can ask yourself, think, okay, well, how would have I liked my father to have conducted himself? And how did fathers that I knew, that I admired, conduct themselves? And how did great men in history who would be models for fathers conduct themselves? And what is the eternal spirit of the redeeming father? Those are all the same question at different levels of depth. And if you ask yourself that question, you'll stumble towards a revelation of the answer. And then it's incumbent on you to embody that, to act it out. You could ask a different question. What stupid things am I doing that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing, both, that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing, that are interfering with me being that? And man, that's a great question to ask yourself every morning. What stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where, weak and useless as you are, you could stop that. And part of the reason I wrote this one rule here, in the first book, I think it was, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Well, why did I formulate it like that? It's like, well, you can't tell the truth because, what the hell do you know? But some of the things you say are lies, and you know it, and some of the lies that you tell, you could just stop telling. Well, start with that. Incremental death and regrowth. Incremental death and rebirth. And you let the lies die, and you let something new emerge instead, right? That's the resurrection. So you let the spirit of deceit perish, and you let the eternal spirit of redemption arise in its place. And that's really good for you, and it's really good for your wife. It'll spice up your sex life like mad, and because she'll actually want to have you around. And that's kind of useful if you're trying to seduce someone, even your wife, who you might think is otherwise obligated, and perhaps she is, but I don't know how much fun that is. Obligatory sex. It's like, that's not a very good idea. And it'll be really good for your kids, and maybe there's enough to you so that it won't just be good for you and your wife and your kids, but maybe it'll be good for your friends, and then maybe for your community, and who knows what would happen if you really got your act together. There is this weird idea that's central to our culture that because we're all of divine value, that we have the spark of God himself within us. And but we don't allow that to make itself manifest because we lack the courage and the faith. And I think that's exactly right. And so it's an open question, if you as a father decided you were going to take the bushel off your light, and that'd be great for your kids, And one of the things you got to understand about your kids, this is really worth knowing. Your kids want to have the best relationship with you that they possibly could have. Like they're 100% on board with that idea. Way more than anyone you've ever met in your life. And that means you could have the best relationship with your children that you've ever had with anyone. That's what they offer you. And it's up to you to realize that, and you could. And that's a hell of a, that's a good opportunity, man. You know, even if you've been beat around a lot and betrayed and hurt, you've got those little kids and they're thinking, what do you want to do, Dad? You know, and if you're bitter, that'll cut you to the quick and you'll hurt them. You don't want to do that.
Assumption number 2, peaceful social being is preferable to isolation and to war. In consequence, it justly and rightly demands some sacrifice of individual impulse and idiosyncrasy. Okay, so you want to live alone in the bush? You're going to starve to death and be eaten by black flies. It's not a good solution. Okay, so you have to cooperate with other people, and that means you can't get to be your whimsical self 100% of the time. It means that most of you has to be sacrificed so that you can be approximately like everyone else. Now that's a real sacrifice, right? It's a sacrifice of it might even be a sacrifice of some of the unique qualities that everyone needs from you. Socialization costs, but the advantage of it is, well, we get to exist. Look, we can all sit together in this hall and no one has their hands around each other's throats. And we're talking about serious things. Okay, man, that's worth something. And what it's worth in part is you don't get to be whatever spectacularly colored creature you want to be all the time. You have to do what you can to be normal and predictable. And it's not like normal and predictable is the highest virtue, because it's not. And being more than normal and being unique and creative and contributing in that way is extraordinarily important. But the fundamental point is that social being requires the sacrifice of a certain amount of individual idiosyncrasy. And that's a fundamentally conservative claim. It's like you should do what everyone else does unless you have a really good reason to vary. It's a good rule. It's like you do what people have done throughout time. You grow up, you find a partner, you establish a stable relationship, you get a job, you make yourself useful, you have some children, you do something productive and interesting with your spare time, and you try to act like a respectable human being. That's what you do. That's a conservative ethos. And if you have something spectacular about you that needs to be revealed to the world, then break some rules, man. Go right ahead. I'm dead serious about that. But most of the time you don't. And even if you happen to be a special person, and you might be, 90% of you still isn't special. So most of the time you're still going to be following the rules. And the rules aren't there to oppress. They're there to keep us away from each other's throats. Because human beings are very warlike, and we're very competitive, and we're very aggressive. And if we are fortunate enough to have woven together a social fabric that basically renders us peaceful and cooperative, we should try disrupting that at our great peril. Because the general rule for human existence throughout the centuries has been turmoil and war. And we don't have that here. And so thank God for that. And it's worth a bit of a sacrifice.
Someone else's rights are my responsibility and vice versa. That almost defines the relationship between rights between people. And liberty is not the allowance to engage in every short-term hedonistic whim impulse. That's chaos, that's not liberty. Liberty is more like what occurs when you have skillful players who are all playing the same game. And game is a good model, right? Because the people who are playing a game, well, they want to play the game. So you're in a free association if you're playing a game. If you're compelled to play, it's not a game. So you have to do it freely. You have to do it voluntarily. You have to abide by a set of governing principles. that lay out the domain for peaceful cooperation and competition within the game. Imagine a game of opposing teams, let's say. And so the rules underneath are the preconditions for the freedom of the game. And so liberty, if liberty is the playing of a game, which I think is an optimized description of liberty, then it has to take place within a set of agreed upon rules that set the playing field for the game. And there aren't an unlimited number of playable games. We know this not least because of attempts to produce multiplayer worlds online. Some multiplayer worlds degenerate into chaos and catastrophe because they turn out not to be iterable playable games. And so the universe of playable games is actually structured in some way that we don't fully explicitly understand, but it does abide by certain principles. Like, well, for it to be a game, it has to be a game played by people who are voluntarily associating. And then there has to be a minimum number of principles that everyone understands. And there has to be some structure of hierarchical punishment and threat and reward. And you have to be a good loser, and you have to be a good winner, and you have to want to play the game again. And you have to facilitate the development of your teammates, all of that. And so liberty has to be construed not so much as the absence of super-ego-like rules that are doing nothing but imposing upon your hedonic, narcissistic, biological whims, as more like the integral balancing of all your motivations and emotions within an iterable structure. That's a liberty. It's like a game. When God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let the people go, that is not what he says. He does not say, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. He tells Pharaoh, let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. And that's repeated 10 times, which means that God means it, by the way, because that's why he says it 10 times. And it means something like, when you move from freedom and you move into chaos, all you've done is move from tyranny into the desert. And the desert's no better than the tyranny. That's why the Israelites get all fractious in the desert. That's why they wander around blindly for 40 years. It's like out of the tyranny where everything was ordered into the desert where nothing is ordered. It's like that's not an improvement. And whatever the promised land is, it's not the mere domain of narcissistic 2-year-old impulsive whims and freedoms. In that sense, I can do anything. It's like, well, no, you can't. No, you can't. And you don't even want to.
Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it, you value it, and no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, well, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse, you know. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this. I can't stop communicating with my mother, who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule.
Solzhenitsyn said, for example, that one man who stops lying can bring down a tyranny. And he did that, so he knew. And he wasn't the only person who did that, but we each bear ultimate responsibility in some sense for the direction of our mutual striving forward. I think that's the core doctrine of the West, you know, that each individual is sovereign and of divine and ultimate worth. And there's a commensurate responsibility with that. And so I thought, when I realized that, partly from reading Solzhenitsyn, partly from reading Jung, partly from reading Dostoevsky, Frankl. Many people were pointing in that direction. Nietzsche, to some degree, that it was necessary for us to become aware of that and to take that responsibility on our own shoulders. And so I've been talking to people as individuals ever since, at McGill, at Harvard, at the University of Toronto, and then more broadly, publicly, inviting people to the adventure of their life, let's say, the moral adventure of their life, driven by my conviction that it actually matters whether you get your act together. Like, it matters eternally in some sense. It matters in a heaven or hell manner. You know, in a totalitarian state, people are locked into tyranny because every individual lies. Every single one. And that's the grip of the totalitarian state. And to the degree that you are living in deceit, let's say, you're contributing to tyranny and the hell that accompanies it. And not in some little way. Not only are you not saying what you should say when you should say it, but you're not doing what needs to be done when you need to do it. You're turning a blind eye and allowing it to happen, but you're also not bringing into the world what you could bring into the world if you brought everything you could into the world. And that lack on your part of bringing into the world what could be there if you would reveal your light, let's say, that's cataclysmic. And that's a painful realization. But it goes along with being a locus of divine worth. And so, I believe that. I believe that if you fail to say what you know to be true, you corrupt the world. You corrupt being. If you lie, you corrupt being. Corrupted being is hell. And if we all lie enough, then we have hell. And whether we all lie enough to bring about hell is actually dependent in much larger part than it's what would you say? It's that you might desire to admit. It's dependent on your choice. And so one of the reasons we love doing what we're doing, I would say, is because we come to these events with thousands of people, and everybody at the event is there because they're trying to aim up. And often doing so, especially in contrast to their previous efforts. And that's unbelievably motivating and wonderful to see, but also necessary. We are very powerful now, all of us, with our incredible technological gadgets, our computational power, and that's going to get way more, we're going to get way more powerful than that really fast. And so you better get your act together, because children can't wield that sort of power without all hell breaking loose. And so I'm very optimistic, because things could be maybe better than we could even imagine. But if we want to, we could sure make them worse. So we all have to decide, are we aiming up with all we got? Or are we aiming down? So, and I hope that whatever we're doing tonight is a contribution to the consensus that we should each do what we can in the confines of our own life, in the unlimited expanse of the opportunity of our own lives to aim up. And if we all do that carefully enough, then up we'll go. There's a gospel statement, something very harsh that's been attributed to Christ. Don't cast pearls before swine. It's a rough statement. And what it means is stop talking to people who aren't listening. It might be that you have someone in your family you can't reconcile with, because when you try to make peace, you're just rebuffed. And you can try multiple times and be rebuffed, and that might be a reflection of your lack of skill, and to some degree probably is, but sometimes you're talking to someone who is pursuing that misery. And until they're willing to not do that, you may not be able to communicate with them. But then part of that reconciliation process with your father would also be the development of the ability to distinguish between people or situations that you can address productively and those you can't. And those you can't, you have to just let go, and not push. And listen. Yeah, right, because people will tell you. Yeah, well, that's true. That's a good point too. I mean, if you keep talking to someone and they're not listening, and you stop talking, sometimes you can stop talking and just listen. And then if you listen hard enough, they'll tell you what their problem is. And that's really worth knowing too. So if you have a family member who you can't communicate with and you keep trying to make your point and it's not working, it's like, quit trying to make your point. It's not working. Why? You're not talking to who you think you're talking to. They're not hearing what you think you're saying. You're not where you think you are. So then you think, okay, where am I? And the answer is, well, you don't know. You've got to start to explore. How do you find out where you are? Listen to them. Don't offer them your opinion at all if it's not working. Just listen. They will eventually tell you what they're up to. And not only will they tell you what they're up to, they'll tell you how you could fix it. And that's really something to watch when you see it happen. So that's a good rule of thumb. You try 3 times to reconcile yourself to someone, with someone, you just hit a wall. It's like, quit talking. Quit talking. Listen harder. If that isn't working, listen even harder. They'll reveal themselves, and then you'll be able to figure out what to do. And that's, again, assuming that they're not aiming down. And now and then you run into someone who's aiming down hard, and you just have to let them hit whatever they're aiming at hard enough to either kill them or wake them up. And often there's not much you can do about that except try to be a good example and to be available if they do need to reach out. So imagine you got 6 or 7 people in your family you want to reconcile with. You can try it with a couple of them. If you're making some progress, good, you can walk down that path. If you're being rebuffed, it's like, well, that's not a door that's open to you at the moment. So yeah, the promise is that you can atone for your past sins by confession and the genuine determination to do better in the future, right? And hopefully that's true, because otherwise when you make a mistake, you're lost and there's no way forward. And the best way forward is to figure out what you brought to the table. That's at least somewhat under your control. I'm having a hard time disciplining myself. I particularly struggle to establish a schedule. How did you make a schedule so that many of your highest goals could be attained? I know that you've talked about making a schedule on many occasions, but I would like a look inside your schedule from the time that you think was your prime. Well, some people find it harder than other people to make a schedule. One thing you might consider doing is doing the personality test at understandmyself.com and seeing what you're like. Maybe you're particularly low in conscientiousness, in which case making a schedule and sticking to a routine, an orderly routine, is going to be quite difficult for you. But that'll at least help you understand perhaps at least some of the problem. Maybe you're high in negative emotion or neuroticism, and so you worry too much about making the schedule, and that just stops you from doing it. I would say, well, first thing to do is, there's 2 things you could do. First of all, the first thing you might want to do is figure out why you want to make a schedule to begin with. So you talked about goals. Well, what is it that you want to accomplish? The Future Authoring Program at selfauthoring.com, another one of our websites, helps people make a detailed plan for the future. And so you can't really have a schedule without having a plan, because the activities you schedule should be intelligently related to goals you wish to achieve that are important to you. And so you need to have goals that you wish to achieve that are important to you, and you have to know what they are. And that's complicated, right? That's like a plan for your life. So it's very difficult. And so that's why we produced this exercise, which helps step you through the process of deciding what you want and need. There's a present authoring program there too that helps you identify your virtues and your faults. And part of your plan can involve capitalizing on those virtues and rectifying those faults. And so that can be an interesting addition to this process. But in any case, you have to figure out what you want. And then you have to figure out how to decompose what you want into actionable steps, right? And those would be the sorts of things that you could put in a schedule. Now, that would mean that your schedule would hypothetically consist of things that maybe you don't exactly want to do, although that would be good, but at least you understand the importance of doing and are therefore somewhat motivated to do. And then you need to break those steps down into small enough increments that you're highly likely to undertake them. So for example, this is a trivial example, maybe you have to do a report on a given topic for school and you're not very good at that. Well, maybe you could go to the library one day and just check out the library. That might be enough. And then maybe you could go to the library and take out a book. And then maybe you could open the book and look through it. Those would be on different days. And then maybe you could sit down and read the first page of the book. And if you can't do that, then the first paragraph. You have to negotiate with yourself and figure out what the largest step you would take towards your goal is that you would take. And if you don't do it, then you make the step smaller and smaller until you find something that you would do. The next thing you need to do, potentially, is to familiarize yourself with a scheduler like Google Calendar. So the first thing to do is open it, and then maybe to figure out how to put in a task and then a repeating task. And might be a pretty simple one to begin with. It's like, well, why don't you list waking up and specify a time, or going to bed and specifying a time, an approximate time anyways, or put in the schedule when you eat. And those are things you do every day. And so that's something you're pretty likely to do. And so that's a success for you. And then, well, then you can start by putting in something small. Maybe you need to read, maybe you need to exercise, maybe you need to have a social event with people. Maybe you need to watch TV, a movie, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. Hopefully it's something you want to do. Put it in the schedule. And you could start by scheduling the things that you would like to do. So you can imagine, well, I like going out to movies. I like going to the mall. I like hanging around with my friends. I like watching TV. I like reading a book. I like listening to music. Well, then schedule those things. And so then you think, well, that means I'm forcing myself to do them. It's not that. It's that now you're allowing yourself time to do them, right? So the schedule becomes a means of you getting what you want instead of an external jailer who punishes you every time you deviate from requirement. So you have to make friends with the schedule, and the schedule has to be your friend, your ally. Well, I shouldn't use that word, but you know what I mean. It should work for you and not against you. You're not generating an external tyrant. You are generating something that you could be held to, and that's be responsible to, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be somewhat burdensome, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. But generally, you should approach it as if this is something that will help you get what you want. And it's also a pretty good way of controlling anxiety, because one of the most common sources of anxiety is just not knowing what to do. And people often think about that as boredom, and it is boredom to some degree, it can be, but it can also be very anxiety provoking. It's like, well, what should I do? I don't know what to do. Well, I have to do something. There's all these things I could do, and I don't want to make that decision every hour. So a schedule that you design that you like can be an incredible relief. And one thing we do know is that conscientious people tend to be lower in negative emotion. And it looks like that's a causal consequence, is that orderly people, for example, because they order their environment and make it more predictable, then they're less likely to be anxious, because we're often made anxious by what is unpredictable. So generating a view of your life that consists of valued goals that you want to attain, and then steps by which those might be attained, and the Future Authoring Program helps you figure all that out. Well, then you can ally that with a schedule, and then not only do you know what you're doing, you know that what you're doing is moving you towards something you want, and that's rewarding. And having your time structured like that and attaining those goals is pleasurable and anxiety reducing. So, that's a pretty good deal, all things considered. And you can start stupid and slow. Like I said, just throw some things in that you're pretty likely to do, and fill in the schedule with broad strokes. And then as you get familiar with it and comfortable with it and maybe even happy with it, you can fill in the details and start to use it in a more sophisticated way. Everyone I know who's accomplished, almost everyone I know who's accomplished, does structure their time explicitly in that manner. They've learned to do that over the years. Now, not everyone does that. Really, really entrepreneurial people might have a harder time with it, especially if they're low in conscientiousness. But and then with regard to the personality test, maybe you do a personality test, the personality test I mentioned, say, and you find out that you're agreeable but low in conscientiousness. Well, so it's going to be harder for you to stick to a schedule, but you do like to please other people, so that's one of the things that you could schedule. You'd be highly likely to do that. If you're extroverted, you could schedule time, socializing with people. If you're introverted, you could schedule time by yourself, walking in nature, for example, or doing whatever else it is that you might want to do by yourself. If you're open, you could schedule in creative time, and then you'd be motivated to do those things. So you're having a hard time disciplining yourself. That's par for the course. Like I said, really conscientious people are more inclined in that direction. But it's hard to discipline yourself in relationship to a goal. It's like training a cart horse to pull a cart. It's difficult. And so you start with little things, and maybe little things that you want to do, and then you can proceed to harder things that you don't want to do so much, for their extrinsic or intrinsic utility, but you have to do them because they're related to something important. You'll get disciplined across time if you do that, and incremental improvement that's sustained is extremely powerful from the perspective of transformation. Progress accelerates, it's not linear, and so if you once you take the first step, the probability that you'll take a slightly larger second step increases, and that increases non-linearly. And so once you get the ball rolling, so to speak, once you start pushing the rock uphill, you can do it faster and faster. And so even if you have to start in a very humiliating manner, that doesn't mean that's where you'll end. One of the things that Tammy and I learned to do, and this was a consequence of me being trained as a behavior therapist, is, we'll just take an example that maybe I was trying to learn how to compliment her when she dressed nicely. And maybe the fact that I wasn't good at that was manifest in the fact that she'd put some effort into her dress, and then I wouldn't respond in the appropriate manner, and that would dishearten her. And I don't particularly remember that exactly happening, but it'll be a perfectly reasonable example. And so then she would be displeased. And then the question would be, well, is she displeased because I'm too stupid to offer a proper compliment, or is she displeased because she's so needy and lacking confidence that she needs a compliment that would go beyond the ordinary. And the answer is, what the hell do we know? Could be one or the other or both. And so what's a possible solution to that? And one possible solution would be, okay, if you do put some effort into your appearance, or I do, we could reverse the situation, but if you put some effort into your appearance and you would like to hear from me exactly the words that would give you, that would reward you for doing that and provide you with the confidence to attempt it again in the future, what would those words be?
You look good without a beard, dear.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Very funny. Very funny. And so, and then you can say, well, if you tell me those words, I will repeat them back to you. And then the person who needs the words might object, well, that's false, it's superficial, it's artificial, it's not spontaneous. And if you really loved me, I wouldn't have to tell you what to say. It's like, well, all of that's wrong. It's like, just because I love you doesn't mean I'm not stupid. And so, in fact, I love you might even be evidence that I am, in fact, stupid. So like, help me out here. I don't know what you want, and maybe you could just tell me, and then I'll tell you what you want, and I'll do it stupidly and badly. But I'll be slightly better at it the next time, and maybe if you let me practice 50 times stupidly and badly, I'll get reasonably good at it, and then that's something that we'll be both good at for the rest of our lives. And that's something worth knowing. You know, if you imagine you're upset with your partner because they haven't delivered something to you, whatever it is that you want, and then there's two questions that arises, right? Are you just like immature and greedy and self-centered, or are they useless and incapable of delivering? And neither of you know, and you have to sort that out. And then you also, as the injured party, let's say, might regard it as a moral necessity on your part to indicate to your partner exactly what you want, just to tell them. Like, it looks to me like if you did this or said this, then that would satisfy me. And then you might say, well, is that reasonable? Do you feel that it would be reasonable for you to offer that? Would you be willing to offer that? Am I pushing you too far? Those are all things that have to be sorted out. And then you can practice that, and you can practice that with the resolution of every dispute that emerges. If you're willing to take to yourself the responsibility of communicating to your partner your conditions for satisfaction, it means you have to admit them to yourself too, which is also very difficult. And then you can help your partner take stupid incremental steps forward, you know, in the direction that you'd like to see expand, and then you can get better at that. And that's unbelievably useful. You can get better at how you have dinner together, or breakfast or lunch. Those things repeat every day, so they're very important. You can get better at how you greet each other when you come home. You can get better at the routine that you fall into, let's say, when you go to bed at night or when you wake up in the morning. All these things that repeat, you know, because that's your life, the things that repeat. You can conceptualize how you might like them to be ordered if they were undertaken in an optimal manner, and you can start incrementally moving forward to that. And you can do that by communicating what you need and want, and by carefully rewarding your partner for taking the appropriate incremental steps forward. And so if you're trying to discipline yourself, you make a goal, you break it down into micro goals, and you implement the micro goals and reward yourself for doing so. And if you do that reliably and you make that a practice, that you'll become more disciplined across time, and you'll move towards the fulfillment of your goals. And that's practically how that's the practical guide for success on that front. If you would like to discipline yourself, which is a very good idea, you need to pick a direction. Pick a direction you want to go first. Pick a goal you would like to attain, and a medium to long-term goal. You might imagine something you need and want, some attainment that you could that would motivate, whose pursuit would motivate you. And you can ask yourself that. It's a good question to ask yourself in general, you know. This is a very good question to ask yourself is, if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would that be? And that's a meditative question. You don't want to force an answer out of yourself. You want to ask yourself that like you would ask someone else. If I could have what I wanted, what would that look like? And you can ask yourself that in a more differentiated way. If I could have the relationship that I needed and wanted, if I could have the friendships, if I could have the job or career, if I could have the educational pathway, if I could adopt civic responsibility in an optimized manner, if I could engage in some creative enterprise, if I took care of myself properly, if I regulated my susceptibility to temptations, what would that look like if it was optimized? And then that sets you up a goal that has some motivational force. This is worth doing. And then you might find, well, you don't do it anyways. And then I would say, well, that's because you're biting off more than you can chew. The next goal is to take your goal and to fragment it into micro goals until you find a micro goal that's small enough that it still presents some challenge that you will do. You set yourself a goal, ask yourself what goal you want to set, and then break the goal down into steps that are small enough so that even someone as pathetic as you could manage them. And that requires a tremendous humility. I know it was frequently the case, for example, with my clients, that I would do an analysis of their situation in life, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, that someone was 30, living at home, in the bedroom they grew up in high school, in a complete bloody state of disorder, both moral and practical. And one of the relatively simple steps that we might agree upon with regards to moving forward is, the person might think, well, you know, I'm 30, I'm really immature, I haven't taken any responsibility for my life, my mother still makes my bed and cleans up after me. It's like, well, why don't you just start with that? You know, because you're not gonna just fix your life. Why don't you just try to clean up your room like you're a mature 14-year-old instead of a dreadfully dismal 30-year-old. And so, first of all, it's really hard for someone, even if they're desperate, to admit that that's necessary, right? Because it's so bloody humiliating. I mean, really, I'm so damn useless that my basic goal is going to be to clean up my bedroom. It's like, well, looks like it. Well, you want to treat other people like you would like to be treated. Well, then you have to figure out, how would you like to be treated? And well, you'd like people to fawn all over you and just lay everything at your feet. It's like, no, that's not something you'd wish for someone that you were taking care of. And then there's an additional problem, which is, it's often the case that people will treat other people better than they treat themselves. That happens extremely frequently. So one of the things I pointed out in chapter 2 was that if you have a dog and you take him to a vet and the vet gives you the prescription medicine, you'll go buy the medicine and you will give it to the dog and you will do it properly. But if you go yourself to a doctor and you get a prescription, there's a 30% chance you won't even pick up the medication. And if you do, there's a 50% chance that you won't administer it to yourself properly. And so I really thought about that. When I first came across that statistic, it was another one of those little facts. I thought, what the hell's up with that? It's like, you'll do it for your dog, so obviously you'll do it for something you care about, and you're conscientious enough so you'll actually do it. So like, why wouldn't you do it for you? Your dog likes you, you know, even your dog would rather that you did, but you don't. And it's actually one of the reasons that modern medicine doesn't work nearly as well as it could, because people just don't take their medication. You make the world a much better place, much worse place, if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself, you know, because, well, that's what the chapter's about. It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, You have a light that you have to bring into the world, and that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place, and that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better, not just so that you're a #1 lobster, none of those things. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that, and it's necessary for you to take care of yourself, despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility.
Look, every ideal is a judge, right? So you posit an ideal and instantly you're in inferior position in relationship to that ideal, and that can be crushing. Okay, so what do you do about that? Well, one answer is no ideals. Well, that's not a good answer, because then you don't have anything to do, right? So and that deprives you of a main source of pleasure, which is observed, generated as a consequence of observed movement towards a valued goal. So if you have a high goal and you see any movement towards it, there's a really powerful potential kick there. So you don't want to dispense with that. But then if you set up an ideal, it can judge you very harshly. So then you have to rearrange your reward philosophy, and instead of punishing yourself as a consequence of perceived distance, you reward yourself for incremental movement forward. And that's not just theoretical. Look, I was stopped by 3 guys on the street this week, 3 separate occasions, and they all told me the same thing. They said that they had read or something I wrote, or listened to something, or watched something, and that it had been helpful. And whenever anybody says that to me, I always ask them, okay, exactly what was helpful and what changed, because I want to know what's helping so that I can understand the target and hit it better. And generally people are pleased to tell me, although sometimes it takes them a while to formulate exactly the description, but all 3 of them said, I stopped comparing myself to other people. So I stopped comparing what I didn't have to what other people had. I left that off the table. And then I started to reward myself for improving over what I was yesterday. And that's profound change, because it means that you actually get your reward structure transformed. And that's a big deal, because that's your source of positive emotion and enthusiasm, encouragement, all of that. So now you can start to encourage yourself for genuine improvement. And it's also pragmatically extremely intelligent, because incremental improvement repeated is virtually unstoppable. And that's like the hallmark of behavioral therapy, that idea. Because what a behavior therapist does is, you come and you say to me, things aren't the way I want them to be. And then I say, well, how would you like them to be? And how are they not that? So we lay out the problem, the territory. And then the next thing we do is lay out a trajectory, which is, okay, well, here's something. You're lonesome. You don't have a partner. Okay, so what are incremental movements can you make towards that goal that you would do that would be helpful? And so maybe you negotiate with the person, because that's what you do if you're a reasonable therapist. And you say, well, look, why don't you decide as a consequence of the conversation, why don't you write out a description of yourself for a dating site? Don't post it or anything. Just write it out. And then let's see if you actually do that. And so then the person comes back next week and they say, I did that. And not only that, I posted it. And you say, great, what's the next step? Or they say, geez, I just kept avoiding that. And then you say, okay, well, we need to break that down. You avoided it. Well, could you write 1 sentence about who you are right now while you're sitting here? And sometimes they can do that right away, or sometimes they can't. And then you make a microanalysis of that. And what you do is you reduce the magnitude of the move forward until you hit the point where you actually will do it. And that's like the secret to good negotiation as well. If you're negotiating with your wife, maybe you want one of her behaviors to change. And then obviously she has to be on board with that, and hypothetically that's going to be a reciprocal process. But what you want to do is find a small improvement that is measurable, that's implementable, that will be implemented, that you can then reward. And that's how you can have your ideal. You can have whatever ideal you want as long as you're willing to reduce your movement forward to achievable increments. But that's okay because they compound. So, and I really learned this as a therapist. And it was one of the things that was so fun about being a therapist is you can take someone through this process and start them on just the tiniest goal, and it just seems trivial, but they'll do it. And then they start moving faster and faster after that point, once the direction has been established. And people make incredible improvement over, not unreasonable spans of time. A few months, maybe a few years, but which is not nothing, but it's not decades, I saw that time and time again. So aim high, but reward yourself for small incremental improvements, especially ones that repeat every day.
Right? Because malevolence clearly exists, and we're all suffer from the weight of malevolent history, right? Because even the grounds we walk on here, which this is a remarkable and wonderful place, I mean, English soil is soaked with blood, just like the soil of every place in the world. That's part of the human heritage, and all of us bear the marks of that conflict in some sense in our souls, partly because of the possibility for us to engage in that, but also partly because part of the reason we're here in all this privilege is because of all that catastrophe. Well, the best way to localize that malevolence is inside you. Right, and to remember that the enemy that you're fighting with, the greatest enemy that you ever fight with, is in your own heart.
Part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. It's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. The gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. So imagine this. So picture this. So you're driving somewhere in your car. Maybe you want to go visit your girlfriend. Okay, so you want to see her. So now you're in this frame, right? And the goal is the destination point and what's waiting there. And the map obviously includes your car. So you see your car. You're inside it. You see your car. You think you see your car, but you don't. And you don't even want to. Part of what car designers do is make it unnecessary for you to see the car. See, they cover the whole car with a homogeneous shell that's like a 1 pixel image. And that's so that you don't get discomforted by the complexity of the car. And the car, the 1 pixel representation of the car, which is this shiny outer shell, is perfectly appropriate as long as the car works. Because you can reduce it to nothing. You can reduce it to an assumption. Okay, so now you're driving to see your girlfriend and a warning light goes on in the dash. Well, what's happening is the implicit complexity of the automobile has just revealed itself to you. And it's threatening the integrity of your map. And that's destabilizing your emotions. And the reason they destabilize is because you've entered a high entropy state. You were in a low entropy state where everything was certain. You could get from point A to B, and you knew exactly how to do that. You knew exactly how much energy it was going to take, and you knew how much time it was going to take. And all of a sudden, something has emerged from the chaos that underlies everything, the complex chaos that underlies everything, and it's signaling to you. And what does it signal? Well, part of what it signals is your unbelievable stupidity in relationship to your car. Because when I was your age, I could sort of understand a car, and if something went wrong with it, I could sort of maybe fix it, and probably not, but at least I could understand it. But now it's like, forget it. All that electronics, you can't even get at it. And so the light goes on, and see what happens now is the map has now become of indeterminate length. How many steps is it going to take you to get to where you were going? Well, it depends on how serious the issue is with your car. Well, that's where your mind starts to go. It's like, well, how serious is this? Should I buy a new car? Was I an idiot when I bought this car to begin with? Am I going to be able to afford this? Am I going to get taken for a ride by a malevolent mechanic because I'm ignorant? And so there's a whole problem of ethics immediately emerges as well. Because now the car doesn't work, but that means you might have to have an encounter with untrustworthy pseudo helpers, and that's also another revelation of your own insufficiency and ignorance, because maybe you're so naive that you're easily fleeced and you're just a walking target for that sort of thing. And all of that pops up. It's the Hydra, it's the Medusa, it's the snakes that are everywhere. They pops up and freezes you. That happens all the time in life, and that's part of what I was writing about in Maps of Meaning. And so then the question is, how do you deal with all those snakes? That's the permanent question. You're permanently susceptible to the radical disruption of your low entropy maps. Permanently susceptible to that. Well, you can't build a map that isn't susceptible to that. So what do? You build yourself into someone who can deal with the anomalous. And that's the hero who faces the dragon. I often don't very well and doubt my ability to stand up for myself in discussions and aggressive situations. How do I know when I've incorporated my shadow? Practice makes perfect. One thing you could do is start keeping track of situations like that, where you walk away thinking that you should have said something. And so then I would say, write down the situation and then think through and write down what you think you should have done. And then, because that's going to help you be sharper on the draw and more ready so write down the situation,
write down what you think you should have done. Then sit and imagine the situation as vividly as you can, right? Get the pictures in your head and imagine yourself doing that, and try to get the psychophysiological responses up as well, so that you make it as realistic as possible. And that will actually help you practice. So Edna Foa, who's a very good clinical psychologist, has demonstrated quite clearly that when treating post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, if you get people to sit and imagine being back in the stressful situation, they have to do that voluntarily and after at least 18 months after the trauma. And she did psychophysiological recording of heart rate and skin conductance and that kind of thing. She showed that the people who showed the highest levels of stress reactivity to the reimagining were the ones who got better fastest and stayed better longest. So you have a situation that you know you haven't mastered. Define the situation repeatedly. Define your proper action repeatedly. Practice implementing that in your imagination, and then start to do that in your real life. And that'll see, if you write down what you should have said, you'll find out what you really want and what you really think. And that'll be your shadow talking. That's the best way to think about it, is that the part of your brain that wishes it would have done something different is the shadow associated with the aggression whose integration would strengthen your character.